we have to look closer now. That's where we're going tonight. The Nephilim were not monsters, I know. That's where your mind goes, where mine went. The first time I really sat with these texts, really let them do what they wanted to do to me. Been told they were ancient and terrible, giants, fallen ones, corrupted half-breeds, caught between heaven and earth, too powerful for one world and too mortal for the other. Stories say this, and the stories aren't exactly wrong, but they leave out the question that matters. Not what the Nephilim were, why they were necessary, what problem they were invented to solve, what kind of world required beings like that to exist at all. Because they didn't appear from nowhere. They were a consequence. Consequences. Consequences, if you've lived long enough to watch a few of them arrive, tend to tell you more about a world than the events that made them. Tonight, we go into the oldest story humanity ever told about beings who fell through the cracks of creation. Too divine to live among mortals, too mortal to go back to the sky, go into the world before the flood, into clay tablets, to ancient Mesopotamia, into Sumerian heaven, into a cosmos where gods walked alongside humans, and the boundary between those two things wasn't a wall. It was a membrane, thin, permeable, dangerous, going into the Nephilim. Settle in. Let the room become what it wants to become. You don't have to hold anything upright tonight. Let the weight find you. Before the Nephilim, there was Sumer, not a place you can visit. Not a name on any map that exists right now. Civilization that rose in the river, delta between the Tigris and Euphrates, roughly 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. In what is today southern Iraq, flat, hot, reed-choked terrain, where two great rivers met the sea, where in the silt and the mud and the impossible fertility of that alluvial plain, something happened that couldn't be undone. Human beings stopped moving. They stayed, built walls, dug canals, vented writing, and I find myself wanting to linger on this, the writing, because it matters more than it seems to. Not for poetry, not for philosophy, not even for recording battles, but for grain, for cattle, for the precise and anxious tracking of things owned and things owed. And then, almost accidentally, almost as a side effect of all that staying still, they invented the gods, or they recorded them. The Sumerians believed the gods had always existed, that the gods, in fact, had created humanity specifically to do the work the gods didn't want to do anymore. Dig the canals, plant the grain, carry the mud bricks up the ramp of the ziggurat. Sumerian cosmos, humans were servants from the first moment of their manufacture. And the gods were lords of the estate, vast, powerful, often indifferent, occasionally furious, sometimes oddly tender, the way powerful beings are, sometimes tender toward the small creatures they've fashioned for their own use. Those gods had names. Those gods had stories, stories pressed into wet clay in tiny wedge-shaped marks, survived the collapse of every civilization that followed. Survived the Akkadians, who absorbed the Sumerians. Survived the Babylonians, who absorbed the Akkadians. Survived the Assyrians, the Persians, Alexander, Rome, the desert, the shifting, Isanjid 20 centuries of indifference, until a handful of scholars in the 19th century dug them out of the ground in what is now Iraq and held them up in lamplight and said, quietly at first, then with what must have been a frightened kind of excitement, "These stories are older than the Bible. These stories are older than anything we thought was old. This is where the Nephilim live, only in the 6 verses of Genesis that mention them so briefly, so cryptically, with such calculated ambiguity. They live in the clay, in the cuneiform, the myths of a civilization so old that when the first pharaoh was crowned in Egypt, Zuma had already been telling these stories for 1,000 years. Let that sit for a moment. 1,000 years of telling before Egypt had a king. The Sumerian universe had a structural flaw, and I think that's the right word for it. Flaw, not just feature. Boundary between gods and humans was real, but it wasn't absolute. Gods could descend, humans could ascend, or at least certain humans under certain conditions. The membrane was permeable. That permeability, that architectural weakness in the design of creation, was the wound through which the Nephilim entered the world. Now let your jaw go. The muscles in your face, been holding something there all evening without knowing it. Let it go. There are 2 minds you need to inhabit to understand what the Nephilim actually were. Perspectives, 2 interior worlds, and they couldn't be more different from each other. And they couldn't be more human. The first is Enki. Sumerian mythology. Enki is the god of wisdom, fresh water, craft, magic, the deep underground ocean called the Abzu, that primordial freshwater sea believed to lie beneath the earth, the source, every spring and river, the foundation beneath the foundation. He is one of the great gods, one of the Anunnaki. Let that word settle before you try to understand it. Anunnaki, gods of heaven and earth, the great ones, the decision makers. Depending on which text you read, there are between 700 and 300 of them. A divine bureaucracy, as complex and political and self-interested as any human court. They have ranks, titles, things they want and things they fear. And Enki, among all of them, is the one who loves humanity most, or maybe more accurately, the one who is most interested in humanity, the one who cannot stop interfering. He's not a villain in these stories. I want to be precise about that, but he's not safe either. Defining characteristic, the thing that separates him from the other great gods, the ones who maintain their distance, is his inability to maintain the boundary. He is always reaching across it, always finding reasons to give humans what humans aren't supposed to have. There is a myth called Enki and the world order. Enki distributes the mess, the divine decrees, the fundamental laws and arts of civilization. Things like kingship, descent into the underworld, musical instruments, the scribal arts, the craft, the smith, to the cities and peoples of Sumer. He doesn't consult the other gods. He simply does it. Gives them out like gifts at a party nobody else was invited to. Because that's who he is. The nature of the problem with Enki. That generosity, that boundlessness, that refusal to hold the line. It's the crack in the wall through which everything else comes pouring. The second mind is Anu. I'll admit something here. Anu is harder for me to write about because the sources are thin, they're not, but because Anu resists interiority in a way that I find genuinely difficult to dramatize. He's the sky itself, vast, impersonal, encompassing, absolute. He doesn't come down, sits above everything and issues judgments from a distance that is itself a form of power. Because the gods who are always present are always implicated in the mess of the world, and Anu, by staying above it all, stays uncomplicated, stays the kind of authority who can always say, I did not authorize this. Whatever went wrong down there, I did not authorize this. In the oldest texts, the ones that predate the biblical version of the Nephilim by thousands of years, it is exactly this question. What was authorized? And by whom? That drives everything forward. The gods who came down didn't come with permission. Or they came with permission and didn't stay within its limits. And the children they left behind were the Nephilim, the fallen ones, half of everything, wholly nothing, belonging to no world completely. Therefore, in some sense, and I don't think this is a stretch, though I'm aware it might sound like one, the most human things in any world. What is more human than being caught between two natures you didn't choose and cannot reconcile? Let that drift. You don't have to catch it. I need to pause here. A lot of thread. And I want to make sure I'm holding the right one. Thing I keep coming back to. The thing that made me want to spend this much time in these texts is not the Nephilim themselves. Exactly. It's the labor. What labor does to a world. What a world organized around labor requires its creatures to become. Anyway, the Atrahasis epic, scholars date the written text to around 1700 BCE, though it pulls from Sumerian material considerably older. It's a Babylonian myth. The story of the Great Flood is embedded inside a larger narrative about work, about hierarchy, about what happens when one class of beings is asked to do labor without end and without rest. Great gods live in comfort. The lesser gods, the Igigi, a lower tier of the divine workforce, are set to digging the rivers and canals. They dig for 40 years, for 80 years. Dig for what the text calls bearing the load alone, and the labor is unbearable. And after what the Babylonians describe as 3,600 years, 6, a number meant to signal time beyond, imagining the Igigi rebel. They burn their tools. They surround the palace of Enlil, the chief of the gods, at midnight while the gods sleep, and they demand relief. Solution, Enki's solution, because of course, is humanity, a race of beings made from clay, mixed with the blood of a god, a murdered god, specifically the rebel leaders whose divine essence is kneaded into the earth stuff. And these clay and blood creatures are set to the labor the Igigi no longer wish to do. There it is, humanity as a solution to a labor dispute. Humans as the answer to a problem that had nothing to do with humans to begin with. The Nephilim come later, but they come from this. From a world already structured around the question, of who does the work and what is owed to those who do it. The ground the Nephilim grow from. It's what I keep thinking about. Maybe more than the Nephilim themselves, if I'm being honest. The labor underneath everything, or the way the whole architecture of this cosmos is built on somebody having to carry the load. The membrane between gods and humans was never going to hold. It was built by beings who needed it to hold, which is, that's not the same thing, not even close. So there, sit with that for a moment. Humanity in this story is the solution to a labor dispute, workaround. What happens when the gods need someone to dig the canals and carry the mud bricks, and none of the divine beings want to do it anymore? We were made to work, made to serve with the divine in spark inside us, that fragment of the murdered God's blood that would give us intelligence enough to do complex labor, but not enough, not calibrated to see through the arrangement and refuse it. Except the divine spark didn't stay neat, cannot put something divine inside something mortal without those two natures pressing against each other, straining, looking for a way out. Vaniji, those lesser gods, the ones who'd already rebelled once, looked down at humanity and felt something the text described with a word that translates roughly as longing or desire. The later Hebrew tradition that inherited and reshaped these stories. Lust. The sons of God saw the daughters of men, and they were beautiful. 6 words. That is all Genesis gives you. 6 words. And then, in the next verse, the Nephilim appear, as if conjured by that seeing, as if the act of divine eyes resting on mortal beauty was itself generative, a kind of unintentional creation. The sons of God took wives from the daughters of men, and the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and afterward as well. The connection isn't incidental, it's structural. The Nephilim are mentioned, and then the flood happens because of something the Nephilim represent, something their existence makes visible, something that God, or the gods, depending on which version we're reading, looks at and decides cannot continue. Your breath is slowing. Let it slow. This story has waited 5,000 years. It will wait for your lungs to find their rhythm. Stay in Sumer a little longer before we follow the thread into its Hebrew revision, because the Sumerian version is stranger and in some ways more honest about what the Nephilim actually were. Anunnaki, those vast divine decision makers, those incomprehensible beings who ran the universe from their ziggurats and celestial palaces, were never entirely separate from humanity. Was they had made humanity from themselves, from their own divine matter, mixed with earth. And some of them, the texts make clear, didn't maintain the separation the divine order required. The text called the descent of Inanna. Why? Inanna, the goddess of love and war and the morning star, the most human of the Sumerian gods. And I want to stay here longer than I probably should, because Inanna is the one who keeps pulling me into these texts, and I'm not entirely sure I can explain why, except that her mythology is so full of longing and rage and grief that she reads less like a deity and more like someone you've met. Text, she descends into the underworld and strips herself of her divine attributes one by one at each of the 7 gates. Her crown, her lapis lazuli necklace, breastplate, which the texts call "Come, man, come," her golden ring, her measuring rod, her robe, her pectoral. One by one, the gatekeeper strips her, and she passes through to the underworld naked of everything divine, dressed only in her own nature. She survives. She returns. But the text uses her experience to map something terrifying. The boundary between worlds can be crossed in either direction, and the crossing always costs something, always strips something away, or always leaves the one who crosses different. The Nephilim were beings who existed in the aftermath of that crossing. They were the cost made flesh. Craig, let me collect the thread here, because we're about to move into the Apkallu, and I want to make sure I'm not losing you on the Sumerian texts that connect most directly to what we now call the Nephilim tradition are the stories of the Apkallu, the 7 sages, ancient beings of extraordinary wisdom who, in the tradition, Eridu, were sent by Enki from the Abzu in the time before the flood to teach humanity the arts of civilization. The word Apkallu means something close to fishman in some translations. Earliest images show them as human above the waist and fish below, or wearing fishskin cloaks emerging from water. In that aquatic quality, there is the liminal, the between worlds. Kalu taught irrigation, mathematics, the calendar, the science of stars, walked it among humans as teachers and advisors, and in some traditions as kings, and they were neither fully divine nor fully human, and the text acts are careful to preserve that ambiguity. To the flood, the sages who continued their work are described in some texts as being only 2/3 Apkallu, or 1/3, as if the divine proportion was diluting with every generation, thinning, pressed thin by the weight of all those mortal generations accumulating on top of it. Here is where your stomach should grow heavy. They knew, post-Diluvian sages knew that with every generation the brightness was fading, that the divine was retreating. What had once been extraordinary, that half-divine nature, that capacity to stand in both worlds at once, was becoming merely unusual, and then unremarkable, and then gone, smoothed away by the relentless averaging of mortal life. Be the grandson of a god and feel that divine nature thinning inside you, to carry the memory of something vast inside, a body already beginning to forget it. This is its own kind of grief. I kept that detail, the thinning, because it does something to me that I find difficult to name precisely. The mathematics of diminishment, the way an inheritance becomes a rumor of itself, is a grief you might understand. You felt things thin, some quality you once possessed, some certainty, some brightness, some particular clarity, becoming less available over time. Grief works that way. Youth works like that, too. Though that thought almost became something else just now, something more contemporary, and I'm pulling back from it. Experience of the Nephilim, beings caught in the diminishment of something they didn't choose to carry, rhymes with something in every human life. Let your shoulders fall. I've been holding them up all evening. Let them fall. Anyway, the story shifts. We follow the thread from Sumer to Cana to the Hebrew tradition that gives the Nephilim their most famous name. Here we have to understand something important. The story changed because new needs arose. Every civilization that inherited this material reshaped it according to what it needed the story to do. Sumerians needed it to explain the origins of civilization and the nature of divine labor. The Babylonians needed it to explain the flood. Hebrews needed it to explain something more anxious, more politically charged, more theologically urgent. They needed it to explain why the human world was corrupt, why the earth was full of violence, why God, looking at the creation, was grieved to the heart. To answer the text offers, Genesis chapter 6, those brief, loaded, barely explained verses, is the Nephilim, or rather what came before, the sons of God taking human wives, a mingling of divine and mortal that produced the Nephilim, and then produced, through some mechanism the text declines to explain, a world so corrupted that only water could clean it. But who were the sons of God? Scholars, theologians, mystics, conspiracy theorists, lovers of the ancient and the strange. 2,500 years of argument, and the answers are more varied than you'd expect. Oldest tradition preserved in the Book of Enoch, a Jewish text written sometime in the 3rd or 2nd century BCE, drawing on much older material, considered scripture by some early communities for being excluded from the biblical canon, says this: the sons of God were angels, specifically a group of 200 angels called the Watchers, assigned to observe humanity from above, who descended to Mount Hermon, and before they descended, made a pact with each other, because they knew what they were about to do was wrong. They knew they were crossing a boundary that should hold, and they knew once crossed it couldn't be uncrossed, for they bound themselves to each other with an oath: we do this together, so if there is punishment, none of us can blame the others. If we sin as one. We fall together. Group. The leader of this group is named Semyaza in the Book of Enoch. Find Semyaza. I'm going to be honest here. This is the part I've spent the most time with, probably disproportionate time, I'm aware. I find Semyaza more interesting than almost any figure in entire tradition, because Semyaza's interior world is the mind of someone who knows exactly what they're doing is catastrophic and does it anyway. Not from ignorance, quite from passion, though desire is threaded through it. Something more complicated, a longing for grounding, for the weight and warmth and urgency of mortal life. Something the immortal cannot experience from a distance. Something that only contact can provide. Watchers looked down and saw a world that was vivid in a way that heaven was not. A world that hurt and bled and sang and died and smelled of rain on hot stone and bread baking and the specific gravity of a sleeping child. And they wanted to be inside that world. The longing to be inside something rather than above it. The recognition that observation, however total, is a kind of exile. Watchers fell because they were. I want to say isolated because lonely feels thin for what the texts are describing. Though lonely is also right. Lonely is exactly right. They fell because God and steady. Their immortality had produced in them a hunger that was unrecognized and unaddressed, and therefore inevitable. There. That's what the texts are actually saying. Underneath the theology, underneath the moral architecture, underneath the flood that comes to clean everything up, saying that the boundary failed, that it was always going to fail. You cannot build a cosmos with a permeable membrane between the divine and the mortal, and then be surprised when beings on both sides press against it. Pied. The Nephilim were the pressure made visible, children of a boundary that couldn't hold. The flood came, the world was cleaned, the membrane was rebuilt, and the longing remained. With that for a moment. Humanity in this story is a solution to a labor dispute, a workaround. What happens when the gods need the canals dug and the mud bricks carried, and none of the divine beings want to do it anymore? We were made to work, made to serve, with a divine spark sung inside us, that fragment of the murdered God's blood. Enough intelligence to do complex labor, calibrate carefully enough that we couldn't quite see through the arrangement and refuse it. Except the divine spark didn't stay calibrated. You cannot put something divine inside something mortal without those two natures pressing against each other, straining, looking for somewhere to go. And the Ijiji, those lesser gods, the ones who had already burned their tools once, looked down at humanity and felt something the texts describe with a word that translates roughly as longing or desire. In the later Hebrew tradition that inherited all of this and reshaped it, lust. The sons of God saw the daughters of men, and they were beautiful. 6 words. That is all Genesis gives you, words. And then the Nephilim appear in the very next verse, as if conjured by the act of seeing, as if divine eyes resting on mortal beauty was itself a kind of generation, unintentional, mediate. The sons of God took wives from the daughters of men, and the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and afterward as well. And then the flood. The connection is structural. Prevalence appear, the Nephilim appear, and the flood follows because of something the Nephilim represent, something their existence makes legible, something that God, or the gods, depending on which version is in your hands, looks at and decides cannot be allowed to continue. The text doesn't explain the mechanism. It doesn't need to. The sequence is the argument. Your breath is slowing. Let it. Story has waited 5,000 years. It will wait for your lungs to find their rhythm. Let's stay in Sumer a little longer before we follow this into its Hebrew revision. The Sumerian version is stranger. In some ways, I think it's more honest about what the Nephilim actually were, though I'm aware that honesty is a strange word to apply to mythology, and I'm not entirely sure I can defend it. Why, I kept it anyway. Anunnaki, those vast divine decision makers, those beings who administered the universe from their ziggurats and their celestial palaces were never cleanly separate from humanity, made humanity from themselves, from their own divine matter pressed into earth. And some of them, the texts make clear, didn't maintain the separation the divine order required. It was text called the Descent of Inanna. Inanna is the goddess of love and war, and the morning star, the most human of the Sumerian gods. And I want to linger here. I always want to linger here. Disproportionately. I know it's disproportionate, because Inanna is the figure in this entire tradition who keeps reaching through the centuries and grabbing me by the collar, whose mythology is so dense with longing and fury and grief and complicated desire that she reads less like a deity and more like someone you've actually known, someone you've eaten dinner with and watched fall apart and watched rebuild. And I find it genuinely difficult to move past her quickly. This text, she descends into the underworld, and at each of the 7 gates, she is stripped of a divine attribute, her crown, her lapis lazuli necklace, breastplate, which the text name, Come, Man, Come, her golden ring, her measuring rod, her robe, her pectoral. By gate, the gatekeeper takes something, and she passes through increasingly bare until she reaches the underworld, stripped of everything divine and dressed only in her own nature. She survives, returns. But what the text is doing, what it's actually doing underneath the narrative, is mapping the permeability of the boundary, the fact that the border between worlds can be crossing. Always takes something, always leaves the one who crosses altered in ways they didn't anticipate and can't fully account for afterward. I need to pause here because the Apkallu are next, and they deserve a clear head. Sumerian texts most directly connected to what we call the Nephilim tradition are the stories of the Apkallu, the 7 sages sent by Enki from the Abzu before the flood to teach humanity arts of civilization. The word Apkallu translates roughly as fishman in some readings. The earliest images show them half human, half fish, or wearing cloaks of fish skin, rising from water, just advisors. In some traditions, kings. They taught irrigation, mathematics, the calendar, the movement of stars. They were between things. The texts preserved that deliberately. To the flood, the sages who continued their work are described in some texts as being only 2/3 Apkallu, or 1/3, the divine proportion diluting with each generation, thinning. And here, where I always feel the weight of it drop, pressed thin by the accumulated mass of all those mortal generations piling on top, the mathematics of it, the inevitability, can feel. The scribes who wrote this understanding something true about inheritance, about the way an origin becomes a rumor of itself across enough time. And I find that I can't move through this part quickly, even when I try, even when I know I should keep the pace up. The thinning is the thing. That's the thing that stays. They knew, post-Diluvian sages knew that with each generation, the brightness was retreating. What had once been extraordinary Sini, the capacity to stand in 2 worlds, to hold both natures without being destroyed by the contradiction, was becoming unusual, and then ordinary, and then gone, bridged away by mortal life's relentless accumulation. To carry the memory of something vast inside a body that is already beginning to forget it, be the grandson of a god, and feel the divine thinning in your blood like a season changing, and know there is nothing to do about it. That's a grief that rhymes with something. Think you know what it rhymes with. I don't need to name it. Experience of the Nephilim. Beings caught mid-diminishment, carrying something they didn't choose and couldn't sustain. That structure of experience is not foreign. You felt things recede in quality, some particular brightness or certainty or access becoming less available. The connection I'm drawing almost became something else just now, something more. I'm pulling back. The rhyme is enough. Let your shoulders fall. You've been holding them up all evening without knowing it anyway. The story moves, Tumor to Canaan, to the Hebrew tradition that gives the Nephilim the name most people know. And to follow it there, you have to understand that the story changed because the needs changed. Every civilization that inherited this material bent it toward what it required. The Sumerians needed it to explain the origins of civilization, the structure of divine labor. Babylonians needed it to anchor the flood in a moral architecture. The Hebrews needed something else, something more pressured, more theologically loaded. They needed it to explain corruption, why the earth was full of violence, why God looked at the creation and was, the text says, grieved to the heart. The answer Genesis offers, those 6 loaded, barely explained verses, is the Nephilim, or what preceded them. The sons of God taking human wives, the mingling that produced the Nephilim, and then through some mechanism, the text deliberately withholds a world so ruined only water could address it. But who were the sons of God? Scholars, theologians, mystics, people who stay up too late with very old books, 2,500 years of argument. The answers are more varied than you'd think. Oldest surviving tradition is the Book of Enoch, Jewish 3rd or 2nd century BCE, drawing on material older than that, considered scripture by some early communities, eventually excluded from canon. It says, the sons of God were angels, 200 of them, a group called the Watchers, assigned to observe humanity from above. They descended to Mount Hermon. Before they descended, they made a pact. Because they knew what they were doing was a crossing that couldn't be uncrossed, so they bound themselves to each other with an oath. We do this together. We carry it together. If there is punishment, none of us can blame the others. We fall as one. The leader is named Semyaza, where Miaza is the figure I've spent. I'll be honest, probably embarrassingly disproportionate, the most time with in this entire tradition. And I think I know why, but I'm going to try to say it precisely. Semyaza's interior world is the mind of someone who sees clearly that what they are about to do will be catastrophic, and who chooses it anyway. The choice isn't ignorance. Desire is threaded through it, yes. But the core of it is something harder to name. something like a longing for weight, for the specific gravity of mortal experience, the hurt and urgency and heat of it. The way a world that bleeds and sings and smells of bread baking and rain on stone is vivid in a way that eternity, apparently, is not. What the watchers looked down and saw aliveness, the kind that is only possible inside a body that can be lost, and they wanted to be inside it, present in it, rather than suspended above it, watching. It is a longing that reads, if I'm being honest, like something a particular kind of person experiences in relation to, I'm stopping there. The ghost of that thought is enough. Let it pass. The watchers fell, because immortality had produced in them a hunger that went unrecognized and unaddressed long enough to become inevitable. They fell together as they swore to, from the children they left behind were the Nephilim. What I think the texts and underneath text are actually saying, underneath all the theology, underneath the flood narrative and the moral framework built around it, the boundary was always going to fail. Cannot engineer a cosmos around a permeable membrane and then be genuinely surprised when beings on both sides press against it until it gives. The design contained the outcome. The Nephilim were the result of pressure that had nowhere else to go. They were the pressure made visible. The flood came. The world was cleaned. The membrane was rebuilt. The longing stayed. While you listened tonight, at this hour when the world has gone dark and your body is finding its way toward rest, I find myself wondering which of these figures pulls at you most. The watchers, who fell because they couldn't maintain the distance the job required, or the Nephilim, who never chose what they were and carried it anyway, or Enoch, the human who walked so close to the divine that he didn't come back. There is no right answer. I'm genuinely curious. The flood, to talk about the flood, because the flood is woven into the Nephilim's story, even as she is, even where Genesis refuses to make the connection explicit. The flood is the response, what the world after the Nephilim required. To understand it, you have to hold it in your mind as something that happened to a specific world. The world the Nephilim had made, rather than as a catastrophe that arrived from outside. In the book of Enoch, the corruption that precedes the flood is described in terms of teaching. Quantities. The Watchers gave humanity knowledge it should not have had. Not only the astrology, the root cutting, the writing, but specifically the arts of violence and the arts of beauty that tend toward violence. The Watcher, named Azazel, taught men to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates, taught them to make ornaments and bracelets and to use antimony on the eyes and to dye garments in colors. 1. The text says, there arose much godlessness, and they committed fornication, and they were led astray. Notice the sequence. First weapons, then ornamentation, then the godlessness. Text places cosmetics and jewelry in the same chain of corruption as sword making, worth sitting with, because the author is tracing a specific path. When capacity exceeds restraint, when you give human beings the ability to do things without giving them the judgment to know when those things should stay undone. The result is what the text calls the earth filled with blood, knowledge without wisdom. That's the accusation. God, or in the older stratum, the divine council, looks at this world and grieves. The Hebrew word is Waitasef. It is the same word used for the pain of childbirth. Same word used the anguish of something deeply personal and close. This is not a cold, administrative judgment coming down from a distance. It is a wound. God is wounded by what the creation has become. And the flood rises from that wound, from grief, and it has the quality of all decisions made from grief. Total, consuming, in some ways as destructive. One who made it as to the world it was made against. You have made decisions from grief. You know what they feel like inside. You know how they look afterward. Covenant with Noah, the rainbow, the promise of never again, is not a triumphant declaration. I want to be careful about how I say this, because it would be easy to overstate it. But the rainbow feels to me less like a celebration and more like the behavior of someone who has done something reversible and is now binding themselves against doing it again. Not triumph. The promise is a restraint. The rainbow is the scar of a wound that did not fully close. Your eyelids be as heavy as they want to be. The flood did not finish the Nephilim. This is where Genesis becomes almost deliberately cryptic. Genesis 6:4 says, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, after the watchers descended, after the Nephilim were born, after the flood that was supposed to end it, afterward, somehow beings are still appearing in the land of Canaan who carry Nephilim adjacent names. The Rephaim, the Anakim, the Zamzumim, the Emim, the Horim turn up in the conquest narratives in Numbers and Deuteronomy and Joshua as the terrifying inhabitants of the promised land, the indigenous giants who make the Israelite spies feel. The text says, like grasshoppers. How did they survive? The text declines to say. It cannot say, without committing to a genealogy the tradition never maintained with any consistency. Simplest reading is that there were subsequent crossings, subsequent instances of the membrane giving way, second wave, or a third, of beings who either had no knowledge of what had happened to the first group, or had that knowledge and proceeded anyway. Pattern is more important than any individual crossing, because the pattern says this will keep happening. The boundary was never stable. Architecture contains this flaw as an ongoing condition. Beings who occupy the space between. Nephilim, Rephaim, giants, whatever name the receiving tradition assigns them, are what always emerges when the membrane goes thin. I need to pause here. A figure I want to get to, Og of Bashan, and I don't want to rush past him, but I also don't want to lose the thread of the Rephaim before we get there. Og, king of Bashan, Book of Deuteronomy, records that his bed was made of iron, 9 cubits long, 4 cubits wide, roughly 14 feet by 6 feet wide. And the text tells you that this bed was still preserved in the Ammonite city of Rabbah at the time of writing. A relic, a monument, evidence that something of this scale had once moved through the world. The detail is spare, there's no drama around it, the bed existed. Here are its dimensions. It was still there. Move on, find that understatement harder to shake than any amount of elaboration would have been, and I'm not entirely sure I can explain why I kept returning to it. In my notes, 14 feet, iron, still there. The Rephaim are the Nephilim's afterlife, in a sense. In Hebrew tradition, they are the shades in the underworld, the hollow ones, the mighty dead, pressed thin by death into something pale and whispering. Ugaritic literature, the material from Canaan that the Israelites were in constant argument and dialogue with. The Rephaim are the ancient dead kings, the divine warriors who occupied the boundary between worlds in life and who after death dwell in a specific part of the underworld from which they can occasionally be summoned, almost exactly what the Book of Enoch describes as the post-mortem condition of the Nephilim. Spirits that wander, that press against the membrane, that exist in a state of being neither fully present nor fully gone. The Nephilim don't end. They thin, transform into the Rephaim, the shades, the whispering, enormous dead who are enormous no longer. The children of heaven and earth who have lost the skies and lost the ground and have only the space between. Diminishment. I find this part harder to write than most of what we've covered. And I've been sitting with this material for a long time. This particular transformation from vast and terrible, pale and thin, is the saddest arc in the whole tradition. Sadder than the birth, sadder than the flood, to have been made of heaven and earth, to become finally a whisper in the ground. Breath is quiet now. Good, that's right. Anyway, there is a scholar named Annas who has spent decades tracing the relationship between the Mesopotamian Apkallu tradition and the biblical Nephilim, and his work makes visible something both traditions seem to half conceal on purpose. The Apkallu, those Sumerian fish sages, those teachers of civilization, were held with deep ambivalence in the later Mesopotamian magical tradition, where was sources of wisdom and sources of harm simultaneously. Cantation texts from the first millennium BCE list post-Diluvian sages described as offspring of Apkallu and human women. That same crossing, that same mixture, alongside demons, beings whose half-divine nature made them dangerous as much as extraordinary. On the list of things that can afflict a person, the knowledge they carried was edged on both sides. Two traditions, different angles, same structure underneath. The divine and the human cannot mix without consequences, and the consequences are always disproportionate to whatever the mixing was supposed to produce. Civilization the Apkallu built did not outlast the flood it was supposed to prevent. The knowledge the Watchers gave did not protect humanity from the violence it supposedly illuminated. Children of heaven and earth were held by nothing. Divine nature offered no protection. Human nature offered no roots, and so they fell, or were destroyed, or became the shades. Pause here. What comes next is the part I find most difficult to hold without losing something in the translation. Humanity kept the knowledge. That's the thing. After the flood, the Nephilim were destroyed or diminished. If the watchers were bound under the earth in darkness, we kept everything they gave us. The writing, the astrology, the metalworking, lots of beauty and violence both. We use them still. Haunt. The light in the room where you're reading this, the network these words traveled through to reach you, all of it is downstream of that original transgression, downstream of the crossing, like water running from a source no one wants to name anymore, but everyone keeps drinking from. What? That image is imperfect. I know it's imperfect, but I couldn't find one that fit better, and I've been trying for a while. You are the beneficiary of the fall. We all are. There is something in that which sits uncomfortably but doesn't go away. The story moves now to the book of Enoch's most extraordinary passage, one that made this excluded, non-canonical text more influential in some ways than many books that made it into the Bible. Is taken up heaven to be shown the sentence passed on the watchers and the architecture of the cosmos, and he is brought before the divine throne. What? So, what he sees, I'm going to stay close to the text here because my own language would only diminish it. The house was built of crystal. Ceiling was like the path of the stars and the lightning, and the lights of the sun and moon were there. The great throne was of crystal, and its wheels were like the shining sun. From underneath the throne came streams of flaming fire, and I could not look. And the great glory sat thereon, and his raiment shone more brightly than the sun, and was whiter than any snow. None of the angels could enter, and could not behold his face, because of the magnificence, glory. And no flesh could behold him. No flesh could behold him. That sentence, specific grief of it. Enoch is human, almost human, becoming something else, standing at the threshold, and the text draws the line exactly there. Not at the angels, at flesh that the watchers abandoned when they descended. The flesh that the Nephilim were half made of, flesh that could not finally look at what the watchers had left behind when they fell toward it. The circle, it closes. The membrane holds at last at the one place it was always meant to hold. No flesh could behold him. Read that again if you need to. Then let it go. Enoch. Flesh, mortal, human. The seventh patriarch from Adam, who would die eventually, even if he had not died yet. Enoch is there, standing before it, looking at the great glory from closer than any angel can come, because God called him in, because God chose a human to see what angels cannot enter to behold. When God speaks to Enoch and says, "Do not fear, Enoch, you righteous man and scribe of righteousness, approach and hear my voice. Tell the watchers of heaven, who sent you to pray on their behalf. You should pray on behalf of men, not men on behalf of you. You should pray on behalf of men, not men on behalf of you." Hierarchy has inverted. The great have fallen. The small have been... No, not small. The small have been given something the great couldn't hold on to. Angels who descended to humanity's level lost their standing in the divine order. And the human who was taken up found himself standing before the throne that angels cannot enter. One who went toward fire without reaching for it. There is something in this reversal that lands in the chest. I don't have a better phrase for it than that. Lands in the chest with the specific weight of something true. The beings who tried to be what they were not, who came down, who wanted in, lost the divine being, who simply walked with God, who just kept walking in the direction God was already going, found himself in the throne room. The watchers were divine. They wanted to be human, paid for it in chains and shame, and the unbearable sight of their children tearing each other to pieces. Enoch was human. He walked with God, stayed human while doing it, kept his feet on the ground even while his direction was upward, and he was taken. Haze, because he simply went where he was invited. Spiritual traditions that inherit this material will do many things with it. Soteriological arguments, angelological debates, the usual machinery of systematization before the theologians arrive with their categories. The raw story says something simpler. Wanting to be something other than what you are is always costly. Cost tends to be proportional to how far you've traveled from your own nature. I'm not sure why I find that so hard to just state plainly. It feels like it should be simple. It isn't. Anyway, her name is Lilith, or her names are many. Lilitu in the Babylonian material, Lamashtu. It's the Lilin in Aramaic, a feminine plural that floats around the edges of the Hebrew text and surfaces, occasionally as screech owl or night creature, depending on who's translating. She is on the margins of this tradition. She's not central. I almost left her out, and I kept coming back, which probably means something. Lilith is, in the Kabbalistic and Midrashic material, the first creature who refused the hierarchy, who looked at the arrangement, the structure, the assignment, the designated order, and said no. She didn't fall because she was seduced. She didn't make an oath on a mountaintop. She left because she refused. Went to live beside the Red Sea, which is in some traditions the boundary between the inhabited world and the wilderness beyond, the edge of the map where the categories stop working, became, in later tradition, a mother of demons, the night creatures, the things that come in darkness, subject of apotropaic charms and amulets and all the elaborate defensive machinery that ancient anxiety builds when it can't domesticate something. They made her a monster. Oldest strand of her tradition describes something different, a being who found the hierarchy unconvincing, who walked away. Find it hard to describe what she represents without reaching for language that doesn't quite belong here. She's the question the story can't answer from inside itself. The world of the Nephilim and the Watchers, the world falling into corruption, had no place for her refusal, for refusal was as threatening as the Watchers' descent. But it moved in the opposite direction. Where they came down into the world, she left it, flooded the Itid, where they flooded the earth with the hybrid children of gods and women Lilith. In the tradition that fears her, is credited with absence, with the children who never came, the presence that is thing. She is the negative space of the Nephilim story. Let me collect the thread here, because I've been holding several things at once, and I want to make sure I haven't dropped one. She endures more stubbornly than the others in some ways. The Watchers are in chains. The Nephilim are shades. Enoch is in heaven. Relics is still by the Red Sea, or somewhere outside the map. Or she is the question itself. What happens to the being who refuses the terms on offer, who finds the categories insufficient, who walks through the wilderness and declines to be resolved? Some questions live outside the story. The framework is not wrong for not answering them. The wilderness is always larger than the map. Antediluvian world. The world before the flood. I keep trying to find a clean way in, and there isn't one. It's a world in which the boundaries haven't hardened yet, which the divine is still leaking into the human, in which the cosmos is still, in some sense, figuring out what kinds of beings are possible and what limits those beings should have. The best I can do. The texture of the thing doesn't quite render. The biblical patriarchs before the flood live for hundreds of years. Adam for 930, Seth for 912, Enoch for 905, Kenan for 910, and so on, each of them vast, each of them almost incomprehensible. To the flood, the numbers drop. Noah's son Shem lives to 600, Shem's son to 438, and the numbers keep falling. Time you reach Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the lifespan has contracted to something recognizable, something with an end you can hold in your mind. The Mesopotamian king lists go further. The first king of Eridu reigns for 28,800 years. His successor for 36,000 kings across 5 cities together, 241,200 years before the flood. Then after the flood, the first post-Diluvian king reigns for 1800 years. Still impossible, but less. The antediluvian world, in both traditions, is a world where the divine substance in things hadn't been diluted yet, mixture of heaven and earth. That primordial contamination, that transgressive mingling, hadn't been washed clean. The beings of that world lived so long because they carried more of the divine. And as that proportion diminished, as the Nephilim's hybrid nature spread through generations of mortal reproduction, the lifespans fell. The vast became merely long-lived. Long-lived became mortal, and then mortality became the baseline, became the expectation, became what the word human means when we use it without thinking. We are, in this reading, diluted descendants of a more concentrated mixture, and I know this image doesn't fully close, but hold it like water that started almost solid with something dissolved in it, and now the solute has spread through the whole volume, so only you'd need instruments to find it. We carry the divine so thin, now we barely recognize it as divine. We call it consciousness, we call it love, the capacity for meaning, experience of beauty. We don't call it divine because the tradition that teaches us how to name things has moved on into the language of psychology and neuroscience and philosophy, different vocabulary for the same ache. I'm not saying one vocabulary is wrong. I'm saying the ancient story has a name for what you're pointing at when you point at those things. Thing in you that reaches upward. That thing that wants more than the body can provide. That thing that grieves at impermanence and longs for something absolute. That's the thin divine, what remains of the mixture, what the flood couldn't wash away because it was already woven into the mortal substance by the time the waters came, carry a tiny proportion of what the Nephilim were. You live in a world that has mostly forgotten this, and perhaps that's why these stories persist across 6,000 years and 3 continents and dozens of cultures. The Nephilim myth keeps surfacing, keeps being told, keeps mattering to people who don't know why it matters. It isn't historical memory. Maybe it isn't just theological tradition. Maybe it's recognition, deep recognition of something in you that already knows this stories, because it is made of the same material. Your eyes are closing. Let them. There is a thread in the rabbinic tradition, Jewish scholarship of the first several centuries of the Common Era, those brilliant interpretive minds that turned the biblical text over and over in the lamplight, finding meanings in the spacing between words, finding whole worlds in the shape of individual letters that offers a reading of the Nephilim so unexpected it has stayed with me since the first time I encountered it. I want to stay with it a moment longer than is probably necessary. I'm going to anyway. In this reading, the sons of God who came down in Genesis 6 were not angels, but sons of powerful men. Isophing, the nobility, the princes, the rulers of the antediluvian world, who called themselves sons of God because they were mighty enough to mistake themselves for divine. And the daughters of men were ordinary women. Women from the common classes, women without access to the circles of power. And the transgression was not supernatural at all. It was simply the powerful taking what they wanted from those who lacked the means to refuse. The Nephilim, in this reading, are the children of exploitation, the children of a world where power declines to limit itself, children of a society where the strong have decided that what they can take is what they are permitted to take, and the violence that fills the earth, the violence that wounds God and precipitates the flood, is the ordinary structural violence of a civilization organized entirely around the prerogatives of the mighty. No angels needed, no supernatural descent. The oldest wound in human civilization. The strong taking from those beneath them, and the children of that taking, walking the earth, bearing a nature they did not choose and cannot escape. Both readings are in the text. The tradition has held both simultaneously for 2,000 years and has not resolved them into one. Perhaps they are pointing at the same thing from different angles, the way the Sumerian and Hebrew flood traditions point at the same thing from different angles, each capturing something the cannot quite reach. Perhaps the story of divine beings, stats, who could not maintain their distance from human beauty, is telling the same story as the story of powerful men who could not maintain their responsibility to those beneath them, just in a different register. One mythological, one political, both true. The Nephilim, whoever their parents were, are the children of boundaries that were not maintained. The sentence. I don't know that I need to ornament it. The world they inhabit is the world that results when the structures meant to protect the small from the vast are allowed to collapse. It is not a comfortable thought, but it is an honest one. And honesty, like all difficult things, tends to settle in the body once you stop fighting to keep it out. Let it settle, be what it is. Noah, we have to spend a moment here. Bor Noah is the answer the tradition offers to the Nephilim, not a supernatural answer, not the flood itself, which is only a reset and does nothing to address what caused the problem, but a kind of model for something. Noah, the text says, was righteous in his generation. That phrase, in his generation, is the one the rabbis circled, argued over, pulled apart for centuries. It mean he was righteous by the degraded standards of a corrupted time. So his righteousness was only relative, only impressive against a low baseline. Or does it mean he was righteous in spite of his generation, which is a much harder thing, which is therefore a much greater righteousness? The tradition argues both ways. Find I can't settle it either. I kept the argument because losing it felt dishonest. What the text is certain about: Noah walked with God. Same words used for Enoch, same walking. When God tells him about the flood, he does not argue. He builds, takes his family and the animals 2 by 2, and he builds the ark, and he enters it, and the rain comes, and the waters rise, and everything outside the ark is undone. Then the rain stops, the waters recede. Noah sends out the raven, then the dove. The dove returns with the olive branch. Then the dove does not return, and Noah knows. He opens the ark, steps out. First thing he does is plant a vineyard. I need to pause here because I think this detail deserves more than I was about to give it. He is going to need wine for what comes next. The weight of surviving, the weight of being the one who lived when everything else died, the weight of being the continuation of a world you watched end. Noah plants a vineyard because Noah is already planning to cope with what he carries, already in his first act of free agency in the new world, reaching for the thing that will soften the edges of enormity he has been asked to hold. Perhaps the tradition is not wrong to treat what follows: his drunkenness, his nakedness in the tent, the strange and oblique episode with his son Ham, as evidence that the weight was heavier than even a righteous man could carry undamaged. Noah is the fully human continuation, the post-flood baseline being who carries no divine hybrid nature, no watcher blood, no Nephilim inheritance, just the human proportion of everything. And even he could not step off the ark clean. He needed the vineyard. The most human moment in the whole story, maybe more human than the building of the ark, is Noah drunk in his tent. Right? The moment of not being able to hold the vastness and reaching for something, anything. That brings you back to a scale the body can manage. The text includes the vineyard. It does not hide it. Find that quietly merciful. The Book of Giants, a text lost for nearly 2,000 years. Fragments surfaced among the Dead Sea Scrolls found at Qumran in 1947, and scholars have been assembling it ever since. Older than the Book of Enoch, or roughly contemporaneous with parts of it, the dating is genuinely uncertain, and I don't want to pretend otherwise. And it tells the Nephilim story from the side, from the perspective of the children themselves. What it tells you is that the Nephilim dreamed for the flood. The children of the Watchers, the giant offspring, the hybrid beings, began to have dreams. Terrible dreams, prophetic dreams, dreams of water and destruction and tablets, it being written, and angels arriving with fire. They came to Semyaza and to Enoch, who seems in this text to hold something like spiritual authority, even among the giants. And they told him what they had seen, brought the visions to the ones they thought could interpret them. The interpretation was the flood. Nephilim were given visions of their own annihilation and could not understand what they were seeing. They knew something a register, felt it in that liminal register between knowing and not knowing, between what the body registers and what the mind can name. And I'm aware that phrase is doing a lot of work, and I'm not sure I've earned it, but I kept it. And when Enoch told them what it meant, they were being shown the consequence of what they were. The flood of the world they had broken, coming. They dreamed their own deaths before those deaths arrived. Let me collect the thread here, because I want to be careful with what comes next. Do you do with a dream you cannot change? With the vision of a consequence you cannot undo? Text records that some of the Nephilim accelerated into the violence. If it all ends anyway, use the power while it lasts. Take everything available while there is still time to take it. Knowledge of ending collapsed for them into a kind of nihilism that expressed itself as consumption, as if the dream were permission rather than warning. And the text does not record any Nephilim doing this, but it feels implied by the very act of bringing the dream to Enoch, that reaching toward interpretation rather than away from it, you could with the knowledge. Let the weight of it be real. Carry the vision of the ending without letting it devour the time remaining. Use the truth as orientation or help toward the ending you want rather than the one you're dreading. The Nephilim could not do this. Their nature too vast, too caught between worlds to find equilibrium, like a tuning fork struck so hard it can only vibrate. It cannot hold a note, would not allow the sitting with, were constitutionally unable to turn knowledge into wisdom. And so the flood came as the dream said it would. The Nephilim were destroyed as the dream said they would be. The world started again, but the dreams were real. The Nephilim saw the truth. The truth, in the hands of beings who cannot be still with it, becomes another form of violence. Anyway, there is a mountain. You should know about this mountain. It is real. Still there, still occupying the same physical space it occupied when the Watchers supposedly descended to it. still visible on the horizon of the northern end of the Jordan Valley, still rising to its nearly 9,000-foot peak above the confluence of what are today Lebanon, Syria, and Israel. Mount Hermon. The name in Hebrew, Hermon, comes from a root that means devoted or banned or set apart. Voted thing in the Hebrew tradition is something removed from ordinary use, consecrated for a specific purpose, and therefore unavailable for anything else. Holy objects are set apart, for offerings are set apart. Things too dangerous to remain in circulation, objects carrying a power beyond what ordinary human handling can safely accommodate, the spoils of a forbidden enemy, the things that have been cursed. Those are set apart, devoted, banned from ordinary commerce with the world. There is a word for this category, and the word is the same word as the mountain's name. I noticed that, and I don't know exactly what to do with it. I kept it here because I couldn't leave it out. Mount Hermon was the devoted mountain. The mountain set apart because it was a threshold, because the ancient world recognized in its geography something that modern cartography cannot capture. That certain places are thin, places where the membrane between the ordinary and the extraordinary is permeable, where the worlds press against each other so closely that the pressure becomes tangible, becomes something you feel in the sternum before you feel it anywhere else. The watchers chose this mountain, or were drawn to it, or found it chosen for them by the nature of what it was. They made their oath there, their collective covenant, their mutual binding, their decision to fall together rather than fall alone on the peak at that altitude where the air thins and the sky very close, and the world below looks so far down, so small, so strangely beautiful in its smallness, that you can almost understand why a divine being might look at it and want to come closer, almost understand, and then recoil, because the understanding is the danger. The moment you almost understand why they did it, you are feeling what they felt, which is the longing, which is what comes just before the fall. Mount Hermon is still there. You went to the Israeli side today. You could drive to a ski resort near the summit. There is a ski resort on the mountain where the watchers descended. I don't know whether to find that funny or I'll leave it. It might be doing both things at once, and that's fine. The holy things become ordinary so slowly you can almost never catch it happening. Every one generation, the mountain is a threshold. 3 generations on it is a notable geological feature. 10 generations, and it is a destination, a thing to be visited and photographed and skied down. While the meaning goes underground, becomes mythological, becomes the kind of thing you find only if you already know to look, only if someone sat you down and told you to look, only if you are lying in the dark, listening to a voice tell you about a story old enough to predate every civilization you know the name of. The mountain is still there, made on it, desperate, doomed, mutually binding, has been echoing forward for 5,000 years of transmission, and is still reverberating right now. In this dark, in this story, you are hearing. This is what stories do. They carry the oath forward, past the death of every civilization that once housed it, or the Enoch function. The thing that walks with something divine, and by walking, keeps it present. We are near the long horizon now, place where the ground levels and the thinking slows, and the breath becomes regular, and the space between thoughts becomes the largest thought of all. Before we reach it, we need to spend a moment with the question that haunts the entire tradition. The question every version of this story circles, gestures toward, and refuses to fully surface. Question you cannot quite name, but have felt building in the dark, in the listening, in the accumulation of all these characters and centuries. Question is, what if the Nephilim were the symptom? Those half-divine, half-mortal beings. Too large for any category, too mixed in their nature for the world to hold comfortably. What if they were the visible expression of something the world was already doing? The world was already inclined toward violence before the descent, already structured to accumulate power in too few hands with too little restraint on how that power moved. Watchers came down to a world that already existed. The daughters of men were already there. Human desire, human beauty, human violence, all of it already operating. What the Watchers added was capacity, power beyond ordinary scale, knowledge beyond ordinary limit. A world which was already inclined toward excess took that additional capacity and used it the way human worlds always use additional capacity to do more of whatever they were already doing. More beauty, more violence, more of the tendency to take what was available to be taken. I need to pause here because I want to be careful not to let this slide past as an abstraction when it isn't one. The Nephilim did not introduce the pattern. They scaled it past what the existing structures could bear. Flood came. This is the reading I find myself returning to, though I hold it loosely, to reset the scale, to return the world to a level of capacity that the available wisdom could manage, bring the volume back down to something that wouldn't blow out the speakers. Tragic possibility. And the tradition never fully commits to this, but keeps leaving evidence of it, keeps circling back, is that the reset did not touch the underlying tendency. Noah's world, washed clean and new, contained the same inclination toward excess that Enoch's world had contained, that the flood was necessary and insufficient. What needed changing was the character of the beings exercising the power. And character cannot be washed clean by water, cannot be reset by catastrophe, cannot be made new by removing the previous version and starting the count again. But the Nephilim story from this angle, and I'm aware this is the angle I find most alive, the one I keep wanting to return to when I should be moving forward, is a story about what happens when more power arrives in a world that has not yet worked out what power is for. That story is not finished. It is happening in the human world, in every generation, every civilization. In every civilization that acquires more capacity than its wisdom can guide, in the gap between what we can do and what we should do, in the enormous and irresistible distance between our power and our judgment. The gap has different names in different eras. The gap is the gap. It does not close. We are the heirs of the Nephilim, carry within us the same fundamental imbalance, the same excess of capacity over wisdom, the same reach toward what is not ours to hold, the same difficulty maintaining the membrane between what we are and what we want to become. The flood does not fix this, has never fixed this. The flood comes, the flood recedes. The world begins again from the ark. There is always a vineyard. Pattern continues. But it continues. It is not ended. The continuing is its own kind of hope, even when the continuing contains everything that makes hope difficult to hold. Anyway, the Nephilim suffer. Nobody asked. Tradition tells you they were vast, terrible, that they consumed everything, were destroyed, became the wandering spirits that afflict the post-diluvian world. Tradition tells you about the Watchers' shame, the flood's necessity, Noah's righteousness, Enoch's walking, almost everything about the world around the Nephilim. For nobody asks what it was like to be that thing, that between thing, half divine, in a mortal world, too large for the structures around you, too mixed in nature for any category to hold you, knowing in some deep register that you came from something vast and are aimed, something diminished, feeling the divine fragment in you as wound or glory, or both at once, unable to settle, unable to stop, unable to find the rest that comes from knowing your place in the order, things. The rest that comes from simply fitting somewhere, knowing you fit. Nobody asks, because asking complicates the story, would make the destruction harder to narrate without cost, parni, would turn the necessary reset into something heavier to consider. For Nephilim are easier as monsters, like static in a radio signal that the flood finally clears. That's the wrong image. I know it's wrong, but the wrongness of it is part of what I mean. They're easier as monsters. The flood is easier when they are monsters. The righteousness of Noah is easier when they are monsters, and Noah is cleanly their opposite. But the tradition is more honest than it means to be. Sometimes the dreams, those terrible prophetic dreams the Nephilim brought to Enoch, those suggest an interior life, suggest awareness, suggest the specific anguish of beings who can see what is coming and cannot change course. That is the interior life of something trapped, something caught between what it is and what it was made from, something that did not choose its own nature and cannot get clear of it. The Nephilim suffered. Tradition doesn't say so plainly, but the tradition leaves the evidence lying around. In the dreams, in the shame of the watchers who made them, quality of what they became after, those wandering homeless spirits, those shades pressing against the membrane, looking for a way back in. Where is the specific quality of suffering? In all of that, that belongs to beings who never had a place that was genuinely theirs. This question is one the story cannot answer from inside itself. Tradition will not answer it. You do not need to answer it tonight. Let it be unanswered. Let it drift in the dark with the other unanswered things, questions you carry that have no clean resolution, that live with you as permanent features of the landscape, rather than problems waiting for the right key. The best questions are like that. Deepen. They become more interesting over time. They stay when everything else has gone. And in the dark, in the warm weight of the almost sleep, they are not threatening. They are just there, present, enormous and quiet, on the horizon. A mountain where something happened once that changed the world, that is still there, still rising above the border of the ordinary into the thin air, where the divine and mortal are separated only by altitude. Let your hands go heavy. Let the weight find your shoulders and carry them down. There is a closing built into this story, and I cannot avoid it. Every version of the tradition provides one, in different forms, in different registers, but always pointing the same direction. And I have been feeling the pull of it for a while now. Nephilim were the problem that required the flood. The flood produced Noah. Noah produced the world. The world produced the covenant, the rainbow in the cloud, the promise of never again, the oldest standing covenant in the Western religious tradition, older than the covenant with Abraham, older than Sinai, older than circumcision and Torah and prophecy and everything that would come to organize the tradition into the shape we recognize. The rainbow covenant is made with every living creature, every future generation, with the earth itself. Flood was a wound, and the covenant is the acknowledgement of the wound, the promise that it will not be reopened, that the reset will not be run again, that whatever comes next, the answer will be water. The Nephilim occasion this. Their existence, brief, catastrophic, dreaming, half divine, produced as its final consequence the oldest promise of protection in the tradition. The beings born between worlds, who could not find rest in either one, who consumed everything and became nothing and pressed against the membrane as homeless spirits. They are the reason the rainbow, what it means, the reason the covenant was necessary. Their destruction is the wound from which the promise of protection was made. Been trying to find the right way to say this for a while, and I'm not sure I have it. The paradox here that the story has been building toward, and when I state it plainly, it sounds too neat. It sounds too neat, like a formula, which is not what it is. Let me try. Things that break the world most terribly are also the things that produce the most durable commitments to protect it. The deepest covenants are made from the deepest wounds. Promise to never again requires something to have happened that makes never again necessary. The Nephilim happened, and from that happening, the covenant, the rainbow, oldest promise, the tradition still. The fallen ones made possible the protection of the world they had been consuming. A word for this kind of reversal, when the source of the destruction becomes indirectly the ground of the protection. The word is not easy. The word is not clean. The word is necessary. Pause here, because what comes next is the close, and I want to arrive at it honestly. We return to where we began. Nephilim were. And here is where I keep stopping and restarting, because the sentence I want to write keeps wanting to define them by what they weren't, and I've been trying not to do that. The Nephilim were exactly as monstrous as their world made possible. Their world made monstrous what it couldn't contain them, because nothing in the structure of creation had anticipated beings in that particular position. Half of everything. The beings who fell between the cracks. Crack was always there. The permeability of the membrane between the divine and the human was in the design. The Sumerians knew this. The Apkallu tradition knew this. The book of Enoch knows this, even as it records the punishment of the watchers who pushed through it. Crack is in the architecture, because without it, there is no reaching upward, no aspiration, no longing for the absolute that makes human consciousness what it is. It was the source of everything that makes human life beautiful and terrible and worth the trouble. The Nephilim fell through it, and in falling, showed how deep it goes. Anyway, you carry the crack. Every human being carries it. That place inside you that is caught between the animal and the reaching towards something more. That is neither fully grounded nor fully arrived. That is the crack. The myth calls Nephilim, and what you might call longing or consciousness or love, or the specific capacity for grief that comes with knowing things end, is the thing that breaks you and the thing that makes you real. Both. Always both, I think, though I hold that loosely. Night in the dark, in the warmth, in the weight that is finding you and asking nothing except that you let it. Let the crack be there. The watchers tried to cross it, bar. The Nephilim were destroyed by it. Enoch walked with God through it and was taken. Lilith refused it and lives somewhere past the edge of the map. Don't need to cross it, or be destroyed by it, or be taken, or refuse it. You can carry it quietly, the way the earth carries Mount Hermon, not resolved, not explained, just present, still there, at the border of the ordinary, rising into the thin air where the worlds press closest, holding within itself the memory of the oath and the oath's consequence, and the long echo of that consequence forward through every generation that has ever looked at it and felt, without being able to say why, that something happened there once that mattered, something that mattered enough to still be mattering now, in the dark, in this moment. Which is what I mean when I say these stories persist. Persist because they are pointing at the crack, and the crack doesn't close. The mountain is still there, and you are still here. Let the weight beneath the blanket keep you. The dark be the dark it wants to be. The story be the only thing you carried tonight, and let it be light enough to carry, and let it go. The watchers on their mountain, the Nephilim in their dreaming, Enoch walking, the flood rising, the dove coming back with the branch, the rainbow, the covenant, the promise. Just sound now. A story settling. This carried you somewhere tonight. Somewhere between waking and the world beyond it. Somewhere between what you know and what you are already beginning to forget. Then, the next story will carry further. All you have to do is return. The fallen ones dream their dreams. The dreaming carries the world forward. Good night.